Many consumers like the idea of buying locally grown food items, but a recent report entitled The Myths of Local Food Policy says local food is not necessarily safer or healthier to eat. To talk more about it is Pierre Desrochers, Associate Professor of Geography at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and a Fraser Institute Senior Fellow. Welcome to Bridge City News, Pierre.
Thanks for having me.
Now, buying locally produced food has been a growing trend in Canada. My family does it all the time. We like to support local producers. Many of us believe buying local means the product is more natural and fresh. What did you discover in the report?
Well, if you're buying it because it is the best alternative available, then there's obviously nothing wrong with it. So, when local produce is in season, if the prices are comparable and it is fresher, I obviously don't have a problem with that. But then you would buy it anyway. So a local food movement cannot simply be along the lines of, let's buy local food when it is in season and when it is the best alternative. You wouldn't need to spend government money to promote that. So really what local food activists have in mind is to extend the purchase of local food to when it is not the best product. Basically, what I argue in the report is that local food is a problem when people try to guilt you into buying things that are not superior alternatives to produce that or meat that you could import from further away.
Now, if we purchase locally grown products, will it not bring our communities closer together and create some more local jobs, perhaps?
Well, the problem with local food is that if you spend more money on your food than if you purchased food that was produced elsewhere for less money, then you have less money to purchase other things locally. So you have less money to spend at the local movie theater, perhaps going out at the restaurant, buy something else nice for your kids. So the job argument cannot be limited simply to buying food. Again, if you spend more time and more money to go to the farmers market, then you have less time for volunteering, for coaching little league soccers, for perhaps doing something nice for your church. So no, spending more time and money on your food doesn't bring more social capital.
Does the buy local policy cost more for consumers and businesses, or does it cost maybe a little bit less?
Well, it depends. Again, if it, the problem you see with local food is that typically producers in one region tend to produce the same thing and they all get to the farmers market on the same day. So often they don't get as much money as they would if they were actually exporting some of their local production elsewhere, if they were good. So it is a bit of a myth to believe that local producers will earn more money by selling locally, again, because nature forces you to produce the same things as your neighbors. So if you show up a little bit later in the day at the farmers market, as you know, you will tend to get better deals because farmers have to sell their things. It's not they don't have a structure that is already in place to export some of their food. And historically, what has happened is that the farmers were made better off by selling a portion of their crops locally, but as they grow, as they become more competitive, they typically also tend to get more money by selling their produce elsewhere when the same type of product is not in season.
Now, does buying locally eliminate the middleman?
Well, it doesn't. You see, especially in Ontario, what we've seen is that farmers are not good at everything. It's like everything else in life. People who go into farming are typically really good at producing food, or at least they're really passionate to do this. Making sales calls are typically not, things that they enjoy. So what you've seen happening in southern Ontario and in southern Quebec too is that a number of people are now intermediaries between local food producers and people who want to buy local food. So restaurateurs, for example, don't have time to go out and talk to every farmer. So this notion of meeting your farmer and interacting socially with those people might occur once a week at a farmer's market. That's nice, but their intermediaries have been around since antiquity, so there's a reason why uh, intermediaries, wholesalers have always been around, whether it was in ancient Greece or today. So farmers would rather deal with one intermediary, it turns out, local farmers to even people who are into local food, rather than making a number of sales calls and delivering their stuff to high-end restaurants or consumers.
Now, you mentioned farmers markets earlier, Pierre. You say sometimes local farmers markets will see cases of fraud. Tell me more about that.
Oh, I'm not. Hey, it's the CBC who's saying it. It's not me. It's CBC and many other people. It turns out that in Ontario, it's very easy to buy food at the food terminal in Toronto and then drive maybe a few hundred kilometers to a place like Peterborough and pretend that the tomato that was originally from Mexico was grown locally and produced according to high local standards. How do you know? There are a few things in life that I live by. You don't ask money from a beggar, and the fly-by-night operators are not worth suing. So paradoxically, large firms, large retailers, large supermarkets have a lot invested in their brands. But small fly-by-night operators at farmers market don't. So the incentives here are not as clear as, or are not as straightforward as many people believe. And sometimes people will look at you in the eyes and still lie, unfortunately.
Now, when we buy locally, does it promote economic development? One would think that when you spend locally, it would benefit other local businesses as well, correct?
Well, it will spend. Well, again, you have to. Do you get enough? Do you get the best value possible for your money? If your local farmer is competitive and at certain times of the year it delivers value, yes, this is obviously good for your community. If the local farmer is unable to compete and you again spend more money on your food, then you have less money to spend on other local economic activities. So, no, when you spend more money and spend more time acquiring your food, the effect overall is negative.
Now, many people believe that buying from a local producer means that the product is potentially safer and sometimes it even tastes better. What do you say?
I would say that there are economies of scale in food safety as with everything else. Local farmers don't have the know-how and cannot purchase the type of equipment that a large successful operator will purchase. You won't have people inspecting the food at every step of production or devising very sophisticated safety protocols. So paradoxically, the worst case of food poisoning in North America in the last 2 decades have come from small organic farmers who, despite, I mean, obviously they didn't want to poison or even kill their customers, but sometimes when you don't really know how to handle manure and compost it properly, you're more likely to have problems like listeriosis or it can be other things like Salmonella, E. coli, than in a large modern factory farm, which has safety protocols and all sorts of knowledgeable people making sure that nothing bad happens. So we don't live in a world where food poisoning is absent, but compared to what it was a century ago, the number of cases of food poisoning have gone down by almost 99%. So we've made a lot of progress.
Interesting, because we've had recent cases of listeria. We've had some of the stories here on Bridge City News. Now, what about more nutritious? Are you saying foods that are mass produced and shipped in from long distances overseas are potentially more nutritious?
Well, the issue here is a bit more complicated. So, not all food that is fresh is necessarily more nutritious. Tomatoes, for example, for reasons that I won't get into detail, are actually more nutritious when they're canned because they've been cooked. You actually get more nutrition out of that. Peaches, whether they're canned or they're fresh, it's about the same. But as far as fresh food is concerned, what you have is that uh, large scale producers who produce food to be frozen or refrigerated right away will collect or will harvest their produce at the best possible time. And as you know, when you freeze it right away under the best conditions, the food doesn't lose any nutritional value. Whereas, for example, if you buy something from a small farmer, let's say here in the GTA in Toronto, the food might have been picked up on a Wednesday, put in a fridge until Saturday morning when it is delivered to the local farmers market. So reality is more complex than just assuming that things being produced closer will necessarily be more nutritious.
Now, I've heard that buying local increases food security. So the argument is that local supplies of food are more dependable than foreign suppliers in times of political and economic crisis. Is that true?
No, actually, it isn't. The problem is that what you're doing then is that you're putting all your food security eggs in one regional basket, and it doesn't matter how dependable your local farmers are. We will have droughts. We might have a flood. We might have early or late frost. All sorts of bad things will happen locally. And historically, what mattered was not that your local farmers really wanted to do their best. They always wanted to do their best. But famine and malnutrition were only eradicated with the advent of the railroad and the steamship, which allowed people in many parts of the world to buy from many different suppliers in many different geographical locations. Again, it's risk management 101. Don't put all your food security eggs in one basket. One year you might have an abundant harvest, the next year you might struggle. Well, you can sort of spread the risk between regions. So now, historically, long distance trade has been the only way to defeat famine and malnutrition.
How can we be rest assured, though, Pierre, that foods coming in from other countries, maybe South America, down in the States, are not using toxic pesticides that will harm us, as opposed to our own locally produced products right here in Canada?
Well, because you're not buying it from the Chinese or the Latin American producer. You're buying it from Lola's, Sobeys, or other retailers out west. And believe it or not, food retailers have no incentive whatsoever to poison their customers. So they make sure that the produce that they sell has been inspected, has been produced properly, and um, it's just common business sense. You're not buying it directly from the producers. They're very knowledgeable people between you and the original producer, so the food is safe. If it is sold by a reputable chain, your food will be safe.
Now, is purchasing locally considered more environmentally friendly? After all, you don't have to transport the food long distances.
Yes, well, the problem with that is transportation is only a tiny segment of the overall impact in terms of greenhouse gas emission of food. So what I mean by that is that, for example, I grew up in southern Quebec. My parents were apple producers. So we would typically pick up apples in September and October, but if you wanted to consume them in Montreal in, let's say, the next in April or May, you needed to put them in climate control warehouses for several months. When it gets down to -30 in the winter, that the place needs to be heated, what have you. But if you import food from the southern hemisphere, their seasons are inverted, meaning that their summer is their winter, their fall is our spring, etc. So you can import apples from South Africa, Chile, or New Zealand in April or May, and they're almost fresh off the tree. So they might have spent 3 weeks in transit, but compared to 6 months in a climate control warehouse, at certain times of the years for certain types of uh, products that comes from the southern hemisphere is actually more environmentally sustainable. But it works the other way. You go to the southern hemisphere, and at certain times of the year, well, you will find kiwis in New Zealand that come from Italy. Because again, it makes more sense to ship kiwis at certain times of the year from Italy rather than keep them in storage for several months.
What about storing food for longer periods of time? Is that more efficient if it's done locally?
Well, again, it would depend. I would argue that well, again, there are economies of scale in everything. So if you're in a region where you have an abundance of produce, electricity is very cheap, the weather is not that harsh, it might make sense. But then what will tell you if this is good or not overall is the price of the product. Typically, if it costs you less money to do that than to import certain food items from other regions, it is probably the more sustainable approach. The problem with agricultural productions, as you and your viewers will know, is that, well, we have all sorts of trade barriers, production subsidies, quotas, and so the price is not as good of an indicator as it would be if we had real free trade in terms of food products. But in the absence of everything else, the price typically tells you what is the most sustainable way to produce food.
Any final thoughts on buying local versus buying from the global food market?
Well, I was raised Catholic, and for me, the one thing I learned as a kid was the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So, if your local food at certain times of the year is the best option, by all means, enjoy it, support your local farmer, but don't be guilted into buying local food when they cannot match products that are imported from further away.
Pierre Desrochers, Associate Professor of Geography at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and a Fraser Institute Senior Fellow. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless. Thanks for watching.